Hey guys, tonight we're taking a gentle, perhaps somewhat unsettling drift back through the mists of time to explore some of the, shall we say, creative ways our ancestors dealt with those who stepped out of line. Imagine, if you will, not just a stern telling off or a timeout, but punishments designed to be unforgettable, terrifying, and often profoundly bizarre. We're talking about an era where justice wasn't just blind. Sometimes it was downright theatrical with a captive audience, and no chance of a get-out-of-jail-free card. You're standing in the shadow of colossal structures, the air thick with anticipation, a low murmur rippling through a crowd eager for... Well, let's just say it's not a comedy show and you probably won't survive this, at least not if you're on the receiving end. The rules were different, the stakes were unimaginably high, and frankly, mercy was often in short supply. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world, so drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself squinting under a relentlessly bright Mediterranean sun. The air is dry, dusty, and carries a strange, unsettling cocktail of scents. Stale wine, hot stone, unwashed bodies, and something else. A faint, musky, animalistic odor that makes the hairs on the back of your neck prickle. You're part of a slow-moving river of humanity, all funneling towards a massive, towering amphitheater, its stone arches reaching for the sky like the hollow eye sockets of some gargantuan beast. This is Rome, the heart of a vast empire, and today the games are on. Though, games feels like a rather inadequate word for what's about to unfold. You shuffle forward, the murmur of the crowd growing into a dull roar as you get closer. Entry, remarkably, is often free. A bit of bread and circuses to keep the populace content, or at least distracted. The sheer scale of a place like the Colosseum, capable of holding tens of thousands, is meant to impress, to overwhelm, to state unequivocally the power of Rome. And one of the most visceral displays of that power is damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beast. Imagine you're not a spectator, but one of the unfortunate souls pushed out onto the scorching sand of the arena floor. The roar of the crowd hits you like a physical blow. High above you can see faces, a blur of humanity, their voices baying for, well, for you. There's no lawyer here, no appeal. Your crime could be anything from banditry or desertion to the increasingly problematic offense of being a Christian. Or perhaps you're a prisoner of war, a living testament to Rome's military might now reduced to pre-show entertainment. Your career prospects, it must be said, are looking decidedly short-term. The sand beneath your bare feet is hot, littered with... well, it's best not to look too closely. Sometimes you'd be given a mock weapon, a flimsy wooden sword perhaps, to create the illusion of a fight. Other times you might be tied to a stake, completely helpless. The Romans, for all their engineering marvels, weren't always about fair fights, especially when it came to capital punishment. This was state-sanctioned terror, a public service announcement written in blood and fear, designed to show everyone exactly what happened if you crossed the empire. Historians still argue whether the sheer number of Christian martyrs fed to lions, for example, is historically accurate, or if a few prominent, well-documented cases were later amplified in retellings. Regardless, it certainly happened, and it left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. Then, from shadowed gateways at the arena's edge, they emerge. Lions from Africa, their manes like dark halos, their roars vibrating through your chest. Bears, perhaps lumbering and powerful, imported from the forests of Gaul or Germania. Sometimes for variety, they might even bring in wild boars or even more exotic creatures like crocodiles, if the emperor was feeling particularly flamboyant and the treasury could stretch to it. The logistics of capturing, transporting, and keeping these animals fed and angry were a minor industry in themselves. One quirky tidbit you might not know is that a whole class of specialized hunters and handlers. The venatores existed, and sometimes these skilled professionals would fight the beast for sport, separate from the executions. It wasn't just about killing prisoners. It was about showcasing the empire's reach, its ability to command even the wildest parts of nature from distant lands. The show itself could be elaborate. Sometimes condemned individuals were dressed in costumes, forced to reenact scenes from mythology, usually the particularly gruesome ones where the hero gets well eaten. It's like a very, very grim piece of immersive theater, and the reviews from the participants were understandably not great. You'd think that after the first few times the novelty might wear off for the crowd, but these spectacles remained popular for centuries. It was a communal experience, a release of reinforcement of the social order. One rather macabre belief that circulated, though its prevalence is debated, was that the blood of a dying gladiator, or perhaps even one of these condemned souls, could cure ailments like epilepsy if ingested. Not exactly something you'd find on the NHS, is it? The heat, the noise, the stench, the sheer overwhelming terror, it's almost impossible for us to truly grasp. You're utterly alone, surrounded by a sea of people who see you not as a fellow human, but as an object, a prop in their day's diversion. The Roman state understood the power of public display. It wasn't enough to simply kill an enemy or a criminal. The death had to mean something to serve as a chilling deterrent. And as the gates rumble open and the first of the hungry beasts steps into the sunlit arena, its eyes fixed on you, the message becomes terrifyingly, undeniably clear. Your story is about to become a gruesome footnote in Rome's grand, often brutal narrative. The dust is already beginning to settle, a fine layer coating everything a silent testament to the life and death dramas that played out here with chilling regularity. It's a far cry from A Quiet Night In, isn't it? Perhaps Rome's version of must-see TV, only with significantly more biting critiques. The sun still beats down, perhaps a little lower in the sky, now casting longer, more ominous shadows across the blood-soaked sand of the arena. You've witnessed, or perhaps thankfully only imagined, the terrifying fate of those condemned ad bestias. But Rome's repertoire of severe punishments wasn't limited to a hungry lion or a grumpy bear. Oh no, they had a flair for the symbolic, for punishments that were not just about ending a life, but about making a statement so profound, so utterly horrifying that it would resonate for generations. Let's turn our attention to one such penalty reserved for a crime considered particularly heinous parricide, the killing of one's own father, or sometimes any close male ascendant. This was pona culae, the punishment of the sack. Imagine the scene shifting. We're still in Roman territory, perhaps not in the Grand Colosseum, but at a riverbank or the edge of the sea. The mood is somber heavy. The crowd, if there is one, is smaller, more subdued. This isn't about spectacle in the same way as the arena games. This is about a deep, ritualistic cleansing of an unbearable societal stain. The person at the center of this grim ritual has been found guilty of spilling the most sacred blood, that of their own progenitor. In Roman eyes, this wasn't just murder. It was an attack on the paterfamilias, the very bedrock of Roman society, an offense against the gods and the natural order. The condemned, and you're trying very hard not to picture yourself in their sandals, would first be scourged, whipped, until their back was a raw, bloody mess. Their head would then be covered with a wolf's hide, a detail some historians still argue about whether it was consistently a wolf's hide or just any animal skin, or if this part was even universally practiced. The symbolism, however, is potent. The perpetrator, having acted like a wild beast, is now cloaked as one. Then comes the sack itself. This isn't your average grocery bag. It's a large, sturdy leather sack and cullius made of ox hide, designed to be watertight at least for a while. But the condemned isn't going in alone. Oh no, that would be far too simple. The Romans, with their particular genius for macabre detail, decided to add companions. According to ancient sources, most notably Cicero, the parricide was sewn into the sack with a selection of live animals, a dog or rooster, a viper, and an ape. Quite the party. Now you might be thinking, why these specific animals? Each one carried symbolic weight. The dog, normally man's loyal friend, now shares a traitor's fate. The rooster, a creature that heralds the dawn and was associated with vigilance and some domestic deities, is plunged into darkness with one who has profoundly failed their familial duties. The viper, an obvious symbol of poison and betrayal. And the ape, well, the ape was often seen as a grotesque parody of a human, and its inclusion perhaps signified the degenerate, subhuman nature of the parricide. One quirky tidbit is that the inclusion of the ape is the most debated among scholars primarily due to the practical difficulties of procuring apes throughout all periods and regions of Roman rule. Some suggest it might have been a later embellishment or only used when an ape was conveniently or inconveniently available. It's a bit like trying to source an avocado out of season, but with significantly more dire consequences for inventory issues. Once the unlikely menagerie and the condemned are securely inside, the sack is sewn shut. The air inside would quickly become foul, filled with the panicked screeching and biting of the animals and the desperate cries of the human. Can you even imagine the sheer claustrophobic terror, darkness, the smell of animal fear, the unpredictable movements and attacks of your unwilling sackmates? It's a sensory nightmare, and it's not over yet. The final act of Poena Coeli involves water. The sealed sack with its writhing, screaming contents is then loaded onto a cart paraded, and finally cast into a river or the sea. The idea was that the parasite, having committed such an unnatural act, should not contaminate the land by burial, nor be consumed by fire, the ashes of which might scatter on the earth. They were to be denied contact with all the elements that sustain life. By being cast into the water, it was hoped they would be carried away, lost, forever denied even a resting place. Historians still argue whether the intent was a quick drowning or prolonged suffering within the sack as it floated. Given the company inside quick seems rather optimistic, the earliest known legal mention of this punishment dates back to the Roman Republic around 100 BCE, but its origins are likely much older, steeped in ancient magical and religious beliefs about pollution and purification. The severity of Poena Coeli underscores the profound Roman horror of parricide. It wasn't just about retribution. It was about erasing the perpetrator from the world in the most defiling and terrifying way imaginable. This punishment persisted for centuries, even being revived by Emperor Constantine, though he apparently omitted the live animals which one supposes was a small mercy. If being drowned in a sack can ever be described as merciful, it's the kind of legal precedent that makes you double-check your familial relationships. Everyone getting along? Are we good? The imagery is stark: a dark sack, a churning river, and the muffled, unholy symphony from within. It's a far cry from the roaring spectacle of the arena, but in its own quiet, dreadful way, it's even more disturbing. It speaks of a society trying to grapple with a crime so offensive, it required an almost supernatural form of erasure. You can almost feel the chill of the river water, the suffocating darkness of the sack, the sheer hopelessness. The water closes over the sack bubbles briefly, and then silence. The state has made its point, and the natural order they hoped was restored. It certainly gives a new meaning to sleeping with the fishes, doesn't it? Though I doubt anyone was getting much sleep in that particular situation. The river has carried away the unfortunate parricide and their frantic four-legged and no-legged companions, and the silence that follows is heavy, almost watchful. But not all punishments in the ancient world, or indeed in periods that followed, aimed for such a definitive, watery end. Sometimes the goal wasn't just to extinguish a life, but to extinguish a reputation, to subject an individual to a kind of social death that could be in its own way just as devastating as a physical one. You might survive, but your place in society, your honor, your very identity could be irrevocably shattered. Let's wade into the murky waters of public humiliation where shame was the executioner's sharpest blade. Picture yourself not on the arena sand or by a forbidding river, but in the bustling heart of a Roman town or perhaps a medieval European village square. The punishment here isn't swift oblivion. It's a slow, grinding destruction of your social standing. In Rome, one of the most significant forms of this was infamia. This wasn't a single act of punishment, but rather a legal status, a black mark against your name that stripped you of many of the rights and dignities of a Roman citizen. You wouldn't be dragged out and stoned, but you might as well be invisible to the law in many beneficial respects. How did you acquire such an undesirable status? Well, certain professions automatically carried a whiff of infamia. Gladiators, actors, prostitutes, and even charioteers, despite their superstar status for some. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? The very people who provided the popular entertainment, The panemics, circenses, bread and circuses we touched upon earlier were often considered morally suspect, existing on the fringes of respectable society. Conviction for certain crimes also led to infamia. Things like adultery, dueling, or being a dissolute soldier. Once branded with infamia, you couldn't hold public office, you couldn't represent others in court, you couldn't even make a valid will in some circumstances or inherit property without complications. It was a legal stain, a declaration that you were, in essence, untrustworthy and base. Historians still argue whether infamia was more about moral judgment or a practical way of excluding unreliable elements from key societal functions. Imagine the social chill. Friends might avoid you, business partners could shun you. You'd become a pariah living in the midst of your community, but no longer truly part of it. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that isn't there to be surrounded by life, but denied full participation in it. It's like being a ghost at your own feast. And this concept of public shaming as punishment wasn't unique to Rome. It's a thread that runs through many cultures. Fast forward a bit into medieval Europe. The specific legal term infamia might have faded, but the practice of public humiliation flourished. Consider the pillory or the stocks. You've probably seen them in movies or illustrations. Those wooden contraptions usually set up in the most public place in town, like the market square. The pillory secured your head and hands, forcing you to stand exposed and vulnerable. The stocks clamped your ankles, often forcing you into an uncomfortable seated position, sometimes with your hands also secured. Now you're the one locked in. Not for a capital crime usually, but for offenses deemed disruptive to the community or morally reprehensible. Petty theft, public drunkenness, selling substandard goods a baker, selling underweight loaves, for instance, was a classic candidate nagging, or even just being a notorious gossip. You'd be there for hours, sometimes days, at the mercy of the crowd. And crowds, as we know, can be fickle. Some might just stare and jeer. Others might take the opportunity to express their disapproval more tangibly. Rotten fruit, mud, animal dung, even stones could be hurled your way. It wasn't just about physical discomfort, though. That was certainly part of it. It was about the intense burning shame of being helpless, exposed and ridiculed by your neighbors, your peers, the people you had to live with once your sentence was served. It's hard to command respect at the next village council meeting when everyone remembers you with spoiled cabbage adorning your head. One quirky tidbit about these devices is that sometimes they were surprisingly specialized. There were scolds bridles or branks, elaborate iron muzzles, often with a plate designed to depress the tongue, specifically for women accused of gossiping or nagging too much. The humiliation was often deeply gendered. The message was clear: conform to social expectations or face public disgrace. It's like an extreme form of social media shaming, but with actual vegetable projectiles instead of mean tweets. Slightly more fragrant, one imagines. This type of punishment relied on the power of community. In a small, close-knit society, your reputation was everything. To lose it was to lose your standing, your ability to trade, to marry, to be trusted. The pillory wasn't just a physical restraint. It was a stage for your social downfall. And it wasn't always just a local affair. For more serious yet not quite capital offenses, there were shame processions. Imagine being forced to walk through the streets, perhaps barefoot, wearing a sign detailing your crime, or carrying a symbolic object related to your offense. The jeers, the scorn, the disappointment in the eyes of people you knew. It was a powerful deterrent. The psychological impact must have been immense. You're stripped of your dignity, reduced to an object of scorn. And this wasn't something you could easily escape. Even after you were released, the memory lingered both for you and for the community. Rebuilding a life after such public disgrace would have been an immense challenge. It was a system designed to enforce conformity and social cohesion through fear of exposure. It's a rather sobering thought that sometimes the most enduring wounds aren't inflicted by a sword, but by the collective judgment of society. It's certainly an argument for keeping your nose clean, or at least being a very discreet gossip. Maybe the ancient equivalent of a delete browsing history charm would have been popular. The echoes of jeers from the pillory fade, replaced by a hushed, almost reverent silence. We're shifting now from the deliberate human-administered shame of the stocks to a realm where justice, or at least its verdict, was believed to come from a higher, more inscrutable power. You find yourself in medieval Europe, a time when faith was deeply interwoven with the fabric of daily life, including the legal system. This is the world of the trial by ordeal, a method of determining guilt or innocence that relied not on evidence or testimony as we know it, but on a direct appeal to God. Imagine you've been accused of a crime, theft perhaps, or even something more serious like heresy or murder. Witnesses are scarce or their accounts are contradictory. The local lord or magistrate, faced with uncertainty, might declare that your fate will be decided by an ordeal. This wasn't seen as an abdication of responsibility, but rather as an admission that human judgment had its limits, and divine intervention was needed to reveal the truth. You're probably thinking this sounds a bit like flipping a divine coin, and in some ways you wouldn't be entirely wrong. There were several popular forms of ordeal, each more nerve-wracking than the last. One of the most common was the ordeal of hot iron. You'd be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron, perhaps a plowshare or a metal bar, for a set distance, usually 9 paces. Your hand would then be bound and bandaged, often by a priest, and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed. If your hand was healing cleanly, you were declared innocent. God had protected you. If it was festering and infected, well, that was a sign of God's judgment against you, and your guilt was confirmed. No pressure on your immune system then. Alternatively, there was the ordeal of hot water. This involved plunging your hand sometimes up to the elbow into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or a holy ring. Again, the subsequent healing process or lack thereof determined your fate. You can almost feel the searing heat, the instinct to recoil, the absolute terror of subjecting yourself to such an injury, knowing your entire future and possibly your life depended on how your flesh reacted. Historians still argue whether the priests or officials overseeing these ordeals sometimes manipulated the conditions, the temperature of the iron or water, the strictness of the bandaging, to favor a particular outcome, perhaps influenced by bribes or local power dynamics. Then there was the ordeal of cold water, which sounds refreshingly cool after all that talk of boiling and searing, but don't be fooled. This one was often used for accusations of witchcraft, particularly later on. You would be bound, typically thumb to opposite big toe, creating a kind of human knot, and then thrown into a river or pond that had been blessed by a priest. If you sank, you were considered innocent as the pure water had accepted you. Of course, you then had to be pulled out quickly to avoid drowning, which wasn't always successful. If you floated, however, you were deemed guilty as the consecrated water had rejected you. It's a classic catch-22, isn't it? Sink and you're innocent but possibly dead. Float and you're guilty and definitely in for a rough time. This led to the rather grim folk belief, particularly prevalent during witch hunts, that witches were unnaturally light, which is why they floated. It's one of those facts that probably cost a lot of innocent people their lives. One quirky tidbit is the ordeal of the morsel, or coarse Ned. This was usually reserved for priests accused of crimes. The accused had to swallow a piece of bread, the coarse Ned, or cheese, sometimes with a feather or a special prayer baked into it. If they choked or couldn't swallow it, they were guilty. It was believed that God would literally stick it in their throat if they were lying. Imagine the sheer anxiety. Try eating a dry cracker when you're terrified. It's not easy. It's like a divine Heimlich maneuver, but in reverse. These practices might seem utterly bizarre to us now, a surrender of reason to superstition. But for the medieval mind, they made a certain kind of sense. In a world suffused with belief in an active interventionist God, why wouldn't he make his will known in such direct physical ways? The ritual surrounding the ordeals was crucial. They were often conducted in or near a church overseen by clergy. Prayers were said, fasts were undertaken. It was a solemn religious ceremony, not just a crude test of endurance. The idea was to create a sacred space where God's judgment could be made manifest. A mainstream historical fact is that trial by ordeal was officially sanctioned by the Church for a significant period. However, its use began to be questioned by theologians and legal scholars. In 1215, a pivotal moment arrived when the Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent III, forbade priests from participating in ordeals. Without the Church's blessing and administrative involvement, the legitimacy of these trials crumbled. This was a crucial step in the development of Western legal systems towards more rational, evidence-based procedures like trial by jury. The courts gradually had to find other ways to determine guilt when divine proof was no longer on the menu. Even so, the underlying belief in God's justice and the idea that truth will eventually out in some tangible way has a long shadow. Think about the phrase trial by fire, which we still use metaphorically to describe a difficult test that proves someone's character or ability. Its roots are literally in these ancient, painful ordeals. You're standing there before the cauldron or the brazier, the eyes of your community fixed on you, the priest intoning prayers. It's a moment of absolute surrender where your fate rests not in your hands, but in the perceived hands of the Almighty, and perhaps on the whims of how quickly your skin cells decide to regenerate. Sweet dreams are probably not on the agenda if you're waiting for that 3-day bandage removal. The priest has unbandaged your hand, or perhaps you've just been fished Section 5 out of a suspiciously buoyant pond, and the judgment divine or otherwise has been passed. Let's leave the solemn. The steam from the ordeal cauldron and the scent of sanctified bread fade, and prayer-filled atmosphere of medieval European justice, and travel eastward to an empire known for its opulence, its intricate, a different, altogether more cloying aroma begins to fill the air. We're traveling eastward now, far from the court's bureaucracy, and as it turns out, a form of punishment so grotesquely inventive, it makes hot iron seem like of Europe to the sun-baked lands of ancient Persia under the Achaemenid Empire. Prepare yourself, because the punishment a minor inconvenience. You find yourself now in the ancient Persian Empire under the Achaemenids, perhaps, or later we're about to explore, is not swift, nor is it particularly dignified. It is a masterclass in slow, inventive dynasties, a land of sprawling palaces and sophisticated culture, but also it appears of terrifyingly creative cruelty. Prepare cruelty, a truly bizarre fate known as scaphism or the boats. If you have a delicate stomach or yourself, for scaphism, sometimes referred to as the boats. Imagine you've committed a serious crime in an aversion to insects. You might want to brace yourself. Imagine you're a captured enemy soldier or perhaps someone who has committed a grievous offense against the Persian King of Kings. Your sentence is scaphism. You'd be taken the eyes of the Persian king, maybe treason or particularly egregious murder. The sentence is past scaphism. It doesn't sound too bad at first, does it? Almost sounds like a gentle boat ride. Oh, how wrong you would be. The name itself comes from the Greek word skaphe, meaning anything hollowed out like a trough to a marshy area or a stagnant pond, somewhere insects thrive. 2 small shallow boats or hollowed out tree trunks are brought forth. They are roughly the same size, designed so that one can be placed on top of a small boat. And that's precisely where your journey into nightmare begins. You are taken to a secluded other like a grotesque human-sized clamshell. You are placed naked inside one of these boats lying spot, perhaps near a stagnant marsh or a slow-moving river. 2 small, narrow rowing boats are sometimes hollowed out on your back. The second boat is then placed over you, covering you completely, but with your head hands, and feet-protruding tree trunks are brought forth. These boats are roughly the same size, designed to fit together one on top of the other like a grotesque parody of a clamshell. You are placed inside the lower boat lying on your back, from specially made holes. You are in effect trapped in a narrow wooden prison, your limbs exposed. Then the second boat is placed on top of you, sandwiching you snugly within. Your head, hands, and feet, body encased. Think of it as the world's worst canoe trip where you are the packed lunch, but are left protruding from holes specifically cut for them, exposed to the elements. The rest of your body is completely encased. The horror is just beginning. Your captors would then force feed you, and not just any food. You think of it as a human-sized wooden coffin, but with your extremities sticking out, unable to move or unable to be compelled to ingest large quantities of milk and honey. This mixture in such amounts would inevitably cause severe diarrhea, if scratch and itch. But this is just the beginning of the horror. The truly diabolical part of scaphism involves you refuse to eat. They might prick your eyes with needles to compel you. The same cloying mixture of milk and honey would then... Milk and honey. Yes, you heard that right. Those sweet, wholesome substances become instruments of unimaginable torment. You be lavishly poured all over your exposed face, hands, and feet, and also into your wooden prison, soaking into your clothes, are forced to ingest vast quantities of milk and honey. If you refuse, your eyes might be pricked until you comply. The goal is to induce violent, prolonged diarrhea. Simultaneously, more milk and honey are poured all over your exposed face, hands, and if you were initially allowed any, though, usually not in flesh. Now, why milk and honey? Firstly, it's designed to keep you alive, albeit miserably, for as long as possible. You're being fed feed and allowed to drip into your eyes, ears, and mouth. This sweet, sticky concoction is as hydrated after a fashion. Secondly, and more insidiously, the sweetness is an irresistible attractant to insects. You might imagine an irresistible attractant for insects of every conceivable variety. Now, picture yourself trapped immobile, lying there, exposed to the elements, covered in sticky sweetness, and slowly, inevitably, the local wildlife begins to arrive, baking under the Persian sun. The milk and honey begin to draw flies which crawl into your eyes, your nostrils, your ears. Wasps and bees arrive, attracted by the sweetness, and their stings are soon adding to your... Flies, wasps, bees, mosquitoes, ants, all the buzzing, biting, crawling denizens of a stagnant wetland agony. As you lie in your own filth within the boats, because remember all that milk and honey you were forced to drink, they would swarm over your face, crawling into your eyes, ears, and nostrils. They would feast on the honey. That too becomes a breeding ground. Maggots begin to hatch in your excrement, and then in, and then on you. Your exposed limbs would become a feeding ground. Inside the boat, in the darkness, your flesh, ants discover you marching in relentless columns across your skin, their bites like tiny needles of fire. Hister things would be even worse. The forced diet of milk and honey would lead to dysentery filling the confined space, with Urians still argue whether the forced feeding aspect was universal, or if simply smearing the victim was more common. The effect, own filth. This, in turn, would attract more insects, particularly those that breed in such conditions. Maggots would begin, however, was largely the same, attracting a relentless swarm. Your exposed parts, your face, your hands, your feet, to hatch in your excrement and then in your flesh burrowing into your body. It's a scenario become a living feast. The insects don't just bite and sting, they burrow. They lay their eggs. Your flesh begins to putrefy while you are still alive, eaten away from the outside in, and due to the induced, that makes a simple lion attack like we discussed in Rome seem almost mercifully quick. The idea was to create a prolonged, agonizing demise. You wouldn't die from a single decisive blow. You would succumb slowly over diarrhea and subsequent infection from the inside out as well. This isn't a quick death. Oh no, scaphism was days, possibly even weeks, to a combination of dehydration, despite the milk starvation, as your body could no longer absorb nutrients designed to be excruciatingly slow. The regular feedings of milk and honey paradoxically kept you alive, prolonging the septic shock from countless infected insect bites and sheer exhaustion from the constant torment. Plutarch, the Greek historian, suffering for days, sometimes even weeks. You're a living buffet, conscious for much of it, feeling every bite provides one of the most well-known and stomach-churning accounts of scaphism, describing the execution of myth, every sting, every squirming larva. It's a level of horror that's difficult to even contemplate. Redates a soldier who had killed Cyrus the Younger in battle, much to the displeasure of Artaxerxes the Sacu. One particularly gruesome, though perhaps apocryphal, account by Plutarch describing the death of Mithridates. According to Plutarch, Mithridates survived for 17 days in this horrific state. 17 days. Can you even begin to comprehend that historians still argue whether scaphism was a common punishment or a rare, exceptionally cruel sentence? Who assassinated Cyrus the Younger claims the victim survived for 17 days. 17 days of being slowly consumed, one reserved for enemies of the state or those who committed truly egregious crimes. Some scholars even question the complete accuracy of Greek accounts of quirky, or rather utterly horrifying tidbit. Related to this punishment is the sheer psychological torment. Beyond the unimaginable physical pain, consider Persian practices suggesting there might have been an element of exaggeration or propaganda to paint their rivals as excessively barbaric. It's a bit the mental anguish, the complete helplessness. The feeling of being defiled, consumed, turned into a rotting incubator for vermin. Like your neighbor complaining about your loud music, but instead of just saying it's loud, they claim it's causing all while being fully aware. The sun beats down, you're tormented by thirst despite the milk, or perhaps because of it, seismic shifts. However, the details reported by more than one source are specific enough to suggest it or something. And the air is thick with the smell of your own decay and the buzzing of countless insects. Sleep would be impossible, very like it was indeed practiced. One quirky tidbit is that the name scaphism comes from the Greek word brief respite from an unending nightmare. It's the kind of punishment that suggests a mind or a society capable, scaphi meaning anything scooped out or hollowed, like a bowl or a boat. It's such of plumbing truly dark depths of cruelty. This wasn't just about execution. It was about obliteration, about making an benign, almost mundane route for such a horrific practice. It's as if they called drawing and quartering example so hideous it would never be forgotten. The veracity and frequency of scaphism are sometimes debated by scholars. Most a bit of a stretch. The psychological torment would have been as severe as the physical. Imagine lying there helpless. Of our accounts come from Greek writers like Plutarch and Ctesias, who were historical enemies of the Persians, and so there's always the possibility of exaggeration for propaganda purposes. However, the descriptions are so specific and consistent across certain, feeling your body literally being consumed while fully conscious for much of the ordeal. The sun beating down on your exposed head, the maddening buzz of insects, your constant companion, the stench of your own decay filling your nostrils. It's a vision sources that it's hard to dismiss them entirely. It paints a picture of a justice system that, at its extremes, valued the agony of the condemned as much as the fact of their death. As you lie there baking in your wooden of hell on earth, meticulously engineered, the Persians, known for their sophisticated empire and administration, clearly also had a dark streak prison. The sweet, cloying smell of honey, now a harbinger of doom. You'd pray for death when it came to punishment. This wasn't just about killing someone. It was about making their death an unforgettable spectacle for unconsciousness, for anything to end the ceaseless torment. It's a stark reminder that human ingenuity, when turned of suffering, a terrifying warning to anyone who might consider defying Persian authority. It's certainly a far cry from a gentle lullaby to drift off to sleep, but it underscores the extreme lengths to which human beings have gone in the pursuit of retribution. One to dark purposes knows few bounds. It makes you rather grateful for the relatively straightforward concept of guilty or not guilty. Hopes at least that the local insects appreciated the catering. Probably left a 5-star review on Ancient Insect TripAdvisor, doesn't it? Perhaps next time you complain about a wasp at a picnic, spare a thought for those who faced in great service, endless buffet, a bit noisy. The ghastly sweet smell of scaphism begins to dissipate, hopefully carried away by a strong breeze as we journey westward again, leaving the marshes of Persia behind. This time our destination is the ancient Greek world, specifically the city-state of Akragas in Sicily during the rule of the tyrant Phalaris in the 6th century BCE. While the Greeks are renowned for their contributions to philosophy, democracy, and art, they too had their moments of chilling ingenuity when it came to inflicting suffering. Prepare yourself for a punishment that is as much about psychological terror and a horrifying auditory experience as it is about physical pain, the brazen bull. Imagine you are a craftsman, Paralos of Athens, a bronze worker of considerable skill. You've conceived of a new, unique method of execution, one you believe will curry favor with the notoriously cruel Phalaris. You present your invention, a life-sized bull hollow cast entirely in bronze, with a door or hatch on its side or back. It's a remarkable piece of metalwork, gleaming and impressive. But this bull is not for farming or for sacrifice in the usual sense. It's designed for a far more sinister purpose. The condemned individual would be forced inside the hollow belly of this bronze beast. The hatch would then be securely closed and latched, trapping them in the dark metallic confines. So far, unpleasant, certainly claustrophobic, but the true horror is yet to come. A fire would then be lit beneath the belly of the bronze bull. As the metal heated up, the interior would become an oven. The person trapped inside would slowly, excruciatingly be roasted alive. You can imagine the searing heat, the inability to escape, the desperation. It's a horrific enough image on its own, but Paralos, in his bid for what he perhaps thought was innovative cruelty, added an acoustic element. The bull was reportedly designed with a complex system of tubes and pipes leading from the bull's throat to its mouth. As the victim inside screamed in agony, their cries would be channeled and modulated by these tubes. The sounds emerging from the bull's mouth wouldn't sound like human screams, but rather like the enraged bellowing or roaring of a bull. The execution thus became a grotesque piece of performance art, a horrifying concert where the music was the amplified, distorted cries of a dying human, transformed into the sounds of an angry animal. Chilling, isn't it? The very sounds of your ultimate suffering twisted into something else, something designed to entertain or at least terrify the onlookers. According to legend, when Paralos presented his invention to Phalaris, proudly explaining its features, including the acoustic mechanism that would make the victim's scream sound like a bull, Phalaris was impressed in his own twisted way. However, he was also, according to the tale, disgusted by the sheer cruelty of the inventor. In a classic turn of poetic justice, Phalaris reportedly ordered Paralos to be the very first to test out his own creation. Let us hear this bull's song you speak of. Phalaris might have said, from your own throat. Paralos was allegedly forced inside and the fire lit. Before he could actually die, however, Phalaris had him removed. Some say because he didn't want to defile the bull with a death. Others say he simply wanted Paralos to suffer more. Paralos was then, according to most accounts, thrown from a cliff. It's a grim lesson. If you're going to invent a horrific torture device for a tyrant, maybe don't explain its features quite so enthusiastically. Your product demonstration might become a little too hands-on. Historians still argue whether the brazen bull actually existed and was used as described, or if it was more of a legend, a piece of anti-tyrant propaganda designed to emphasize the cruelty of rulers like Phalaris. The story is certainly lurid and memorable. Accounts of it come from various ancient writers, including Diodorus Siculus and Lucian, though often writing centuries after Phalaris's reign. Archaeological evidence for such a device is understandably lacking. Bronze, after all, could be melted down and repurposed, especially an object with such grim associations. However, the symbolism is potent. The bull was a powerful creature often associated with strength and divinity, but also with untamed rage. To be consumed inside a metal effigy of a bull, your screams transformed into its roars, was a terrifying debasement. One quirky tidbit about the brazen bull story is that, according to some versions of the legend, after Acragas was conquered by the Carthaginians, the bull itself was taken to Carthage. Later, when the Romans conquered Carthage, Scipio, Aemilianus supposedly returned many looted Sicilian treasures, possibly including the bull, if it indeed existed and survived its travels. It's like a very grim, ancient version of a stolen art recovery, only the art piece is a torture device. The use of such a device highlights a particular aspect of some ancient punishments, the theatricality and the psychological impact on those who witnessed it or even just heard tell of it. The sound, that bellowing roar, would have been terrifying, a constant reminder of the tyrant's power and cruelty. It wasn't just about eliminating an enemy, it was about creating an atmosphere of fear Imagine living in a city where you knew such a thing existed, where the roar of a bull might not be from a nearby field, but from the tyrant's palace signaling another agonizing death. It would certainly make you think twice before voicing any dissent. Whether entirely factual or a chilling legend that grew over time, the brazen bull serves as a potent symbol of tyrannical cruelty. It's a punishment that assaults multiple senses. The searing heat, the claustrophobia, and most uniquely, the horrifying auditory transformation of suffering. It speaks to a depravity that seeks not just to kill, but to mock and distort the very essence of human agony. It's the kind of story that lodges in your imagination a disturbing metallic echo from a distant, brutal past. You can almost hear that low, distorted bellow rolling across the ancient Sicilian hills, a sound that promises nothing but slow, roasting terror. It makes you appreciate a good old-fashioned non-bovine oven, doesn't it? Probably not a feature you'd want to highlight in your Airbnb listing for ancient Akragas. Cozy, centrally located may occasionally feature distant, unsettling bull noises. The metallic tang of fear and the faint, disturbing bellow of the brazen bull slowly recede as we shift our focus from land-based horrors to the vast, often lawless expanse of the C-Section 7. For centuries, life aboard a ship, whether naval or merchant, was a world unto itself with its own strict, the metallic tang of fear and the imagined scent of scorched bronze from Phalaris's codes and its own brutal forms of justice. Discipline was paramount, and mutiny or severe insubordination was met with punishments. Sicily began to fade, replaced by the sharp, briny smell of the sea. We're moving away from land designed to be both a deterrent and a grim spectacle for the rest of the crew. So take a deep breath of based cruelties now, out onto the unforgiving expanse of the ocean, where justice like the waves could salty air try to keep your balance on the swaying deck. And let's explore the terror of keel-hauling be swift, brutal, and utterly indifferent to pleas for mercy. Life at sea in centuries past was harsh. Discipline was ironclad, and punishments for those who stepped out of line were often as inventive and terrifying as anything conceived on dry land. You're on a tall-masted ship, weeks, perhaps months out from the nearest port. The endless prepare to get your feet wet, or rather your entire body, as we explore the uniquely maritime torment of keel-hauling. Expanse of the ocean stretches in every direction. It's a confined, isolated world where the captain's word is law. Imagine you're a sailor in the 17th or 18th century, perhaps aboard a naval, and the smooth running of the vessel is a matter of life and death for everyone aboard. Someone has committed a serious vessel or even a pirate ship. Discipline was often brutal in both spheres. The captain's word is law and meet offense. Perhaps striking an officer inciting mutiny or repeated flagrant disobedience. They are about to face wantonly or serious dereliction of duty is met with the harshest of penalties. One of the most dreaded of these was keelhaw, of the most feared punishments in the maritime world. Keel hauling. The name itself has a harsh scraping. The very name sends a shiver down your spine, doesn't it? It's grimly descriptive sound, doesn't it? And that's quite descriptive of the experience. The condemned sailor would be tied to a... The procedure was as brutal as it sounds. The condemned sailor would be tied to a rope sometimes. Rope typically with weights attached to their feet to help them sink. This rope would be looped beneath the ship, running with weights attached to your legs to help you sink. This rope would be looped beneath the ship, running from one side under the keel, the central spine of the ship's hull, and up the other side. The down under the keel, the central spine of the ship's hull, and up the other side. You would then be hoisted. Sailor would then be hoisted up often to a yardarm, and then dropped into the sea on one side of the ship, up on one side of the vessel, perhaps on the yardarm to add a bit of dramatic height. And then suddenly, the crew on the opposite side would then begin to haul on their end of the rope, dragging the unfortunate individual down, dropped into the churning cold seawater. The crew on the other side would then begin to haul on their end of the rope under the ship's hull and then up out of the water on the other side. Now, the hull of a wooden ship, especially one that had been at sea for a while, was not a smooth surface. It dragging you down under the entire width of the ship's hull and then up out of the water on the opposite side. Now the ship's hull, especially in those days, was not a smooth, pristine surface. It would be covered in barnacles, sharp-shelled marine growths that were like a million tiny razor blades. As the sailor was covered in barnacles, sharp-shelled marine growths, splinters of wood, and general marine detritus. As was dragged under the keel, their body would be scraped, slashed, and torn by these encrustations. If they were lucky, they might be pulled under relatively quickly. If they were unlucky, or if the ship was particularly wide, the passage you were dragged under the keel, your body would be scraped, lacerated, and torn by these encrustations. It could take longer, increasing the risk of drowning, as well as severe lacerations. And if they were really unlucky, it was like being dragged across a giant, submerged cheese grater. If you were lucky, you might lose consciousness quickly, from they might get stuck on some underwater protuberance, leading to a truly horrific, struggling demise. There were variations to this: the shock of the cold water, or a blow to the head against the hull. If unlucky, you'd be agonizing, delightful procedure. Sometimes, particularly on larger ships, they might be keel-hauled fore and aft, meaning draggedly aware of your flesh being flayed. There was also the very real prospect of drowning, as the passage under the hull from the bow, the front to the stern, the back of the ship. This was an even longer, could take a terrifyingly long time, especially on larger ships. You're trying to hold your breath water, forcing more agonizing journey along the barnacle-encrusted keel. The speed at which they were hauled was also a factor. 2, its way into your lungs, pain erupting all over your body. There were generally 2 main ways keel hauling was slow, and the risk of drowning was immense. Too fast, and the impact with the hull could be instantly fatal or performed. The first and supposedly milder version, though mild is a very relative term here, involved a quicker pass under the hull. Sometimes from bow to stern along the length of the keel, though this was rarer, and caused massive trauma. It's the kind of decision where there are no good options. Would you like the rip you to shreds slowly option, or the rip you to shreds quickly while also potentially drowning you option? Posed an even greater risk of the victim getting snagged. The more common form was across the beam as described. The severity survival was possible, but often those who endured keel hauling died shortly afterward from their grievous wounds infection or internal, could also be adjusted by how quickly or slowly the crew hauled the rope. A slow keel hauling would prolong injuries caused by hitting the keel. If they did survive, they would be scarred for life, a walking testament to the harsh the agony, and increase the risk of drowning and serious injury. A very quick one, while still horrific, might offer a sliver more justice of the sea. The psychological trauma, too, would be immense. Imagine the terror of being plunged into the cold chance of survival, albeit as a shredded, traumatized mess. Historians still argue about the exact frequency and precise methodologies. Dark water, unsure if you'll ever reach the surface again, feeling your flesh being torn from your bones. It makes of keel hauling across different navies and time periods. Official records are often stark, while anecdotal accounts can be more a plank walk, look like a pleasant seaside stroll. One quirky tidbit: while keel hauling is most famously associated with European lurid, survival was by no means guaranteed. Many died during the ordeal itself from drowning or massive trauma. If navies, particularly the Dutch, who have some rather detailed ordinances describing it from the 16th to the 19th, you did survive being pulled out of the water on the other side, you'd likely be horrifically injured, suffering from deep lacerations, broken bones, and near drowning. Infection in the wounds was almost a certainty in the unhygienic conditions century, and the English variations of dragging a person under a boat existed in different forms in other maritime cultures as well. It seems the horrifying ingenuity of scraping people against rough surfaces wasn't limited to one continent. Perhaps it's an instinctive of a sailing ship, often leading to a slow, painful death days or weeks later. It was a punishment designed not just to eliminate a problem sailor, but to serve as a terrifying example to the rest of the crew. Imagine witnessing that. Punishment when boats and insubordination meet. A mainstream historical fact is that the severity of keel hauling often depended on the size of the ship and the mood of the captain. On a smaller vessel, the ordeal might be fraction, the screams quickly muffled by the water, the taut rope, and then the emergence of what was left of your cruelly less horrendous. On a massive ship of the line, it was almost certainly a death sentence, mate. It would certainly make you think twice about complaining about the quality of the ship's biscuit. This week, the practice was officially abolished by most navies by the mid-19th century, being deemed excessively cruel, replaced by other evil as a bit crunchy, but you know what? It's fine. Everything's fine. One quirky tidbit is that keel hauling wasn't exclusive to European navies. Variants of it existed in other maritime cultures, though still harsh forms of discipline, like flogging with the cat o' nine tails, which was no picnic either. The Dutch were particularly known for it, and indeed the English word keel hauling comes from the Dutch K, mind you. Historians still argue about how frequently keel hauling was actually carried out versus how often it was merely eelhellen. The practice was formally abolished in most navies by the late 18th or early 19th century, threatened. Detailed records of every punishment on every ship across centuries are understandably patchy. However, its codification in naval regulations as notions of discipline and punishment began slowly to evolve. The British Royal Navy, for example, officially banned it, suggests it was a recognized, if extreme, judicial option. The threat alone would have been a powerful tool for maintaining order in 1779, though it had largely fallen out of favor, even before then replaced by flogging, or hanging in the brutal and often desperate conditions of life at sea. Remember that cramped ship you were on with all those other potentially from the yardarm for the most serious offenses? It's a bit like banning a monster from your closet after you've grumpy sailors subsisting on weevil-infested hardtack and remembering the comforts of dry land. Yeah, the captain already realized monsters aren't real, but you ban it just in case. A mainstream historical fact is that maritime needed a way to ensure you all rowed in the same direction, both literally and metaphorically. You can almost feel law known as the customs of the sea was often harsh and summary. Captains on long voyages far. The lurch of the ship, the coarse rope in the crew's hands, the tension as the condemned man is prepared from any shore-based legal authority had immense power over their crews and needed to maintain order in often cramped difficulty. The splash as he hits the water, then the grim rhythmic hauling. It's a punishment born of the unique and dangerous conditions. Punishments like keel hauling, flogging with the cat o' nine tails or maroon environment of a ship at sea, isolated, self-contained where an example needed to be made swiftly and unambiguously. The ocean izing were part of a brutal system designed to enforce absolute obedience. The sheer physicality of keel hauling is what makes vast and unforgiving, and so too, it seems, was maritime justice in its most extreme form. It's enough it's so appalling. It combines so many primal fears, drowning, being helpless, and dragged severe pain in the cold to make anyone prone to seasickness opt for a nice stable job on land, perhaps as a very well-behaved librarian, dark indifference of the ocean. You're pulled under into a world of murky chaos, your body scraped raw, the immense weight of the ship pressing down from above. It's a sensory overload of terror and agony. When? At least the only thing scraping you there would be overdue book fines. The chilling spray of the sea and the imagined scrape of barnacles on skin recede as we return to dry land, though our next destinations are no less terrifying. We're back in Rome for one, but not to the grand spectacle of the arena this time. Instead, we're looking at fates that involve being enclosed, entombed, or dramatically cast away. Punishments that emphasize a permanent, often lonely end. Think of the primal fear of being buried alive, or the terrifying finality of a one-way trip off a cliff. Let's first turn our gaze to a very specific group in Roman society, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were some of the most revered women in Rome. Chosen in childhood from patrician families, they were tasked with tending the sacred flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth home and family in her temple in the Roman Forum. This flame was believed to be inextricably linked to the safety and continuity of Rome itself. If it went out, it was a dire omen. The Vestals served for 30 years, during which time they were sworn to chastity. Their purity was paramount, a symbol of Rome's own integrity. For this sacred duty, they enjoyed extraordinary privileges and high status. They could own property, make a will, and even pardon condemned criminals if they encountered them by chance on their way to execution. They were in many ways above the usual constraints placed on Roman women. However, the punishment for a Vestal virgin who broke her vow of chastity was uniquely horrifying immurement. That is being buried alive. If a Vestal was found guilty of incestum, the technical term for her unchastity as her relationship with the state was considered akin to that of a daughter to a father. The repercussions were severe not just for her, but for Rome. It was seen as a profound pollution of the sacred, threatening the city's divine favor. Imagine the scene. The guilty Vestal dressed in funereal robes would be carried in a closed litter, as if already dead, through silent mourning crowds to a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field, just inside the city walls near the Colline Gate. There a small underground chamber would have been prepared. It wasn't an empty tomb, however. It would be furnished with a couch, a lamp, and a meager supply of food and water. A few loaves of bread, a little milk, some oil. This was a symbolic gesture. The Romans were reluctant to directly shed the blood of a Vestal as she was sacrosanct. By providing these necessities, they could claim with a rather twisted piece of legalistic piety that she wasn't being directly killed by them. She was merely being left in a place from which she could not escape, and her subsequent death from starvation or suffocation was, well, up to the gods or her own dwindling resources. A neat way to sidestep the taboo, don't you think? It wasn't us, it was the lack of breathable air of them. The Pontifex Maximus Rome's chief priest would utter prayers, and the Vestal would then descend a ladder into her tomb. Once she was inside, the ladder would be withdrawn, and the entrance sealed with earth, entombing her alive in the darkness. Her male lover, if identified, usually faced a more straightforward, albeit equally brutal death, being flogged to death in public in the Forum Boarium. The double standard is rather stark, isn't it? One quirky tidbit here is the very specific nature of the items left with the Vestal. Why the lamp, the bread, the water? Some historians suggest it was a ritualistic way of allowing the Vestal to die with some semblance of her daily life, a final grim echo of her duties and sustenance. It was a profoundly isolating and terrifying end, sealed away from the world she once served, left to contemplate her fate in a silent, dark chamber. It makes you wonder what went through their minds in those final hours or days. But Rome also had a flair for the dramatic public plunge. For certain crimes, particularly treason or desertion by soldiers, or for those who gave false testimony, the ultimate destination was the Tarpeian Rock. This was a steep cliff on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Roman Forum. The condemned would be taken to the top of this rock and simply thrown off. No elaborate ritual, no slow suffering, unless they survived the fall, which was unlikely but not impossible, leading to a grislier end at the bottom. Just a brutal, decisive, and very public execution. It's the Roman equivalent of being cancelled, but with more gravity literally. The rock was named according to legend after Tarpeia, a Roman maiden, possibly a Vestal virgin herself, in some versions of the story, who betrayed the city to the Sabines in exchange for what she thought would be gold bracelets, what they wore on their left arms. Instead, the Sabine soldiers, disgusted by her treachery, crushed her to death with their shields, which they also wore on their left arms. Her body was then supposedly thrown from the rock that thereafter bore her name. A cautionary tale about being very specific when making deals with invading armies. Historians still argue whether every notable traitor was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, or if it became a more symbolic location of ultimate disgrace, with the phrase deserving the Tarpeian Rock being a common curse or condemnation, even if the actual execution method varied. The visual, however, is powerful. The might of Rome, concentrated in its most sacred hill, literally casting out and destroying those who threatened its foundations. It served as a potent warning, visible from the very heart of the city. Imagine standing in the Forum, the center of Roman life, and looking up at that cliff knowing its deadly purpose. It's like a permanent rocky billboard advertising the price of betrayal. The act of being immured or thrown from a height taps into primal fears. The terror of being trapped, of suffocating, of falling. These weren't just about ending a life. They were about making a statement of absolute rejection and finality. The Vestal's tomb cut her off from the sacred flame she was meant to protect. The Tarpeian rock cast the traitor out from the city they had wronged. In both cases, the punishment was deeply intertwined with the physical and symbolic geography of Rome itself. You're either sealed within its earth or violently expelled from its heights. It's a stark contrast to the sprawling openness of the sea we just left. Yet the sense of a final, inescapable doom is just as profound. The dusty silence of the Vestal's tomb and the imagined impact from the Tarpeian rock slowly give way to a different kind Section 9 of Public Spectacle 1, not of swift death, but of prolonged mobile discomfort and deep humiliation. We journey. The echoes of a body falling from the Tarpeian rock and the suffocating stillness of an underground tomb fade away as we travel once more to the east, this time to Imperial China. Here for centuries, a particular device served as a common instrument of justice, a walking embodiment of shame, the kanga. It's less about immediate physical agony and more about a slow grind of exposure, ridicule, and the oppressive weight of your offense made visible for all to see. Picture yourself accused of a crime in Ming or Qing dynasty China, perhaps theft, petty assault, or maybe you've disturbed the public order in some way. Instead of being locked away in a dark cell, though that might happen too, you find yourself fitted with a kange. What is a kange, you ask? Imagine a large, heavy wooden board or frame, typically square or rectangular with a hole in the center, just large enough for your neck. This board is then placed around your neck, resting on your shoulders. It's essentially a portable pillory, a mobile stockade. The kange, also known as a zhang, could vary in size and weight, often depending on the severity of the crime. Some were relatively manageable, just a heavy collar. Others could be enormous, several feet across and weighing upwards of 20, 30, or even more pounds. These larger versions effectively pinned your arms, making it impossible for you to bring your hands to your face. You couldn't feed yourself. You couldn't wipe your own sweat or swat away insects. You were utterly dependent on the charity of others, or perhaps family members, for basic sustenance and hygiene. It's a bit like wearing one of those cones vets put on dogs to stop them licking a wound, but 100 times heavier, more public, and with significantly more social stigma attached. No cone of shame jokes here, though, because this was serious business. You would be paraded through the streets, forced to stand or sit in a public place, perhaps near the local magistrate's yamen office, or in the marketplace, wearing this cumbersome wooden burden. Attached to the kange would often be a paper strip or inscription detailing your name, your crime, and the duration of your punishment. Everyone who passed by would know exactly what you had done. It was an exercise in enforced transparency, your guilt made tangible and unavoidable. The duration of this punishment could range from a few days for minor offenses to several weeks or even months. Imagine the sheer physical discomfort. The weight of the board on your shoulders day and night would be exhausting. Chafing would be a serious issue, leading to sores and infections. If you couldn't use your hands, keeping clean would be impossible, leading to further misery and ostracism. And then there's the public humiliation. You are on display, an object of scorn, curiosity, or perhaps even pity, but rarely respect. Your dignity is stripped away piece by piece under the relentless gaze of the community. One quirky tidbit about the kange is its surprising longevity and widespread use throughout East Asia, not just China, but also in variations in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. It was a remarkably persistent form of punishment, enduring for centuries, well into the early 20th century in some places. Its visual impact was undeniable. Photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries often show individuals in kanges, providing a stark, tangible link to this form of justice. It's one thing to read about it, it's another to see the weary, resigned faces of actual people enduring it. The kange served multiple purposes. It was, of course, a punishment for the offender. It was also a powerful deterrent for others. Seeing someone in a kange was a clear reminder of the consequences of breaking the law, and it reinforced the authority of the state, demonstrating its power to control and shame those who transgressed. Historians still argue whether the primary aim was physical suffering or the psychological impact of prolonged public shaming. Likely, it was an effective and economical combination of both. It cost less than imprisonment and outsourced some of the guarding to the public eye and the immobility of the device itself. A mainstream historical fact is that the severity of the congwe was often calibrated. For example, the Great Qing Legal Code had specific regulations regarding the weight of the congwe and the duration it was to be worn linked to the particular crime. This indicates a structured though harsh system rather than arbitrary cruelty. Lighter kangs for lesser crimes, heavier ones for more serious infractions, making the punishment fit the crime in a very literal, weighty sense. Sometimes multiple people involved in the same crime would be cangered together, their wooden collars yoked, forcing them to move in awkward, coordinated misery, a team-building exercise from hell. Think of the practicalities. How did you sleep? Probably propped up against a wall if you were lucky. How did you eat or drink if your hands were pinned? Only if someone helped you. It fostered a terrible dependence and vulnerability. And in a society where face, personal dignity, and social standing was profoundly important, the loss of face associated with being cangered was a devastating punishment in itself, sometimes considered worse than a quick physical beating. It's the ancient equivalent of having your worst moment go viral, but instead of just your online reputation suffering, you're physically carrying the evidence around with you. The sun beats down, or perhaps a cold rain falls. You're there in the congwe, the wood rough against your skin, the weight a constant ache. People stare, whisper, maybe a child points. Your sense of self shrinks under the relentless public exposure. It's a slow, wearing down kind of punishment, less about sharp, immediate agony like the brazen bull or keel hauling, and more about a relentless, soul-crushing endurance test. The congwe stands as a powerful symbol of how shame and public exposure, amplified by physical discomfort, could be wielded as potent tools of social control. A visible yoke not just on the neck, but on the spirit itself. It makes you appreciate the relative anonymity of a modern courtroom, doesn't it? Or at least the ability to eat your own sandwich. The heavy weight of the congwe lifts from our collective shoulders, and the judgmental eyes of the marketplace crowd recede as we embark on our final journey, this time to the very edges of the known world, or at least the edges of an empire's tolerance. We're exploring the concept of exile and penal colonies, the idea that some individuals are so undesirable, so disruptive, or their crimes so offensive that the only solution is to remove them entirely from society, banishing them to distant, often inhospitable shores. This is not about a quick dramatic end, but a slow fading away, a condemnation to oblivion. Imagine you've committed a crime deemed serious enough to warrant exile. In ancient Rome, this could be anything from political dissent to certain criminal offenses. The punishment known as relegatio, or the more severe deportatio, meant being sent away from Rome sometimes to a specific barren island in the Mediterranean or remote frontier outpost. You might retain your citizenship and property with relegatio, but deportatio often meant losing both. You were effectively erased from Roman society, cut off from family, friends, and your entire way of life. The poet Ovid, for example, famously endured exile to Thomas, a remote town on the Black Sea, by order of Emperor Augustus. His mournful poems from exile speak volumes about the psychological pain of isolation and the longing for home. It's like being unfriended by an entire empire. But the concept of punishing by banishment and forced labor in distant lands truly took off on a grand systematic scale much later, with the rise of European colonial empires. As these empires expanded, they found themselves with unwanted populations. Convicts, political dissidents, the chronically impoverished. What to do with them? The answer for several centuries was often transportation to a penal colony. Think of Britain's use of Australia or France's infamous Devil's Island in French Guiana. You're now on a cramped, disease-ridden transport ship, part of a human cargo destined for a place you've likely never heard of, thousands of miles from home. The journey itself is an ordeal with poor sanitation, meager rations, and high mortality rates. It's a precursor to the hardship that awaits. If you survive the voyage, you arrive in a rugged, often hostile environment, far from any semblance of civilization as you knew it. Here your sentence truly begins hard labor under brutal conditions overseen by harsh taskmasters. You might be felling timber mining or building infrastructure for the new colony, effectively contributing to the very empire that cast you out. Australia is perhaps the most well-known example of a penal colony. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain transported over 160,000 convicts to various Australian colonies. These weren't all hardened criminals in the modern sense. Many were driven to petty theft by desperate poverty in the overcrowded cities of Industrial Revolution Britain. Steal a loaf of bread. You might find yourself on a one-way trip to the other side of the world. It's a rather extreme form of out-of-sight, out-of-mind social policy. Life in a penal colony was often one of relentless toil and despair. Food could be scarce, disease rampant, and punishment for any infraction swift and brutal. Flogging was common. Escape was incredibly difficult given the remote locations and unfamiliar, often dangerous terrain. You were in essence imprisoned by geography itself. Historians still argue about the true economic motivations versus the stated penal aims of these colonies. Were they primarily dumping grounds for undesirables, or were they also a calculated effort to exploit new territories using forced labor? The answer is likely a complex mix of both. One quirky tidbit is that, for some convicts, transportation, despite its horrors, eventually offered a chance at a new life that might have been impossible back home. Once their sentences were served, or if they earned a ticket of leave for good behavior, some former convicts managed to build new lives, become landowners, and even prosper in the colonies. Australia's early European society was significantly shaped by these convict foundations, a heritage that was once a source of shame, but is now more openly acknowledged and explored. It's like the ultimate redemption arc, only it involves surviving years of what sounds like absolute misery first. Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana became synonymous with extreme hardship and suffering. Established in the mid-19th century, it was reserved for political prisoners and hardened criminals. The tropical climate, rampant disease, malaria, and yellow fever were rife, and the soul-crushing isolation made it a living hell. The most famous prisoner was Alfred Dreyfus, a French artillery officer falsely accused of treason, whose wrongful conviction and imprisonment there became a major political scandal in France. His eventual exoneration highlighted the injustices possible within such a system. The sheer hopelessness of a place like Devil's Island was its defining characteristic. It wasn't just a prison, it was designed to break you body and spirit. The penal colony system represents a particular kind of societal response to crime and dissent removal and isolation. It's a geographical solution to a social problem. The condemned are not just punished within their society, they are expelled from it, sent to the margins, often to live out their days in forgotten corners of the globe. It's a slow social death, a gradual fading into obscurity punctuated by back-breaking labor and the constant threat of disease or despair. It's a long way from the theatrical punishments of the Roman arena or the intense localized shame of the Congo, but its impact on the individual was no less profound. You are a ghost in your own lifetime. Your existence meaningful only in terms of the labor that can be extracted from you. Your identity subsumed by your convict status. The sun sets over a remote, unfamiliar horizon. You're thousands of miles from everything you knew. A forgotten soul in a land that feels like the end of the earth. The dream of home is a distant, fading ember. This is the essence of the penal colony, not just a punishment, but an attempt to erase you from the story of your own society. It's a chilling testament to how far states would go to purify their communities, casting out those they deemed unfit, one agonizing shipload at a time. And so our journey through some of history's most bizarre punishments, from the roaring crowds of Rome to the desolate shores of distant colonies, draws to a close. We've seen how justice, or what passed for it, could be a terrifying spectacle, a symbolic ritual, a slow grind of shame, or complete erasure from society. Each method in its own unsettling way reflected the fears, beliefs, and power structures of its time. Word count 1099. Now, as the shadows lengthen and the tales of these harsh realities begin to recede from the forefront of your mind, let the stillness of your room embrace you. The echoes of ancient crowds, the sting of imaginary whips, the chill of distant oceans. Let them all soften, carried away on the gentle current of approaching sleep. These were the ways of different worlds, different times, filled with struggles and understandings far removed from our own. It's a reminder perhaps of the long and often winding path humanity has taken towards the systems of justice we recognize today, imperfect as they may still be. But tonight, those struggles are not yours to bear. You are safe in your own space, in your own time. Allow the narratives to become distant whispers like the rustling of leaves in a faraway forest, or the soft murmur of waves on a shore you need not visit tonight. Let your breathing slow, deepening with each easy exhalation. Feel the comfort of your bed, the gentle support beneath you, a haven of peace. There are no demands here, no judgments, only the quiet invitation to rest. Whatever thoughts or images may have stirred within you, let them now settle like dust motes in a still room, gradually finding their place of repose. The world outside will wait. For now, there is only this moment, this peace, this drift towards the soothing oblivion of sleep. Close your eyes and let the last vestiges of these ancient, bizarre tales melt away, leaving only calm.